Shut up and sit down.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Master the NEC, the podcast where we talk about the National Electrical Code and, of course, all things electrically related. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host for today's lesson. Thank you for joining me today. Hopefully, everything is going wonderful in your world. Again, we're in Texas, and boy, it's been raining a lot. But hopefully that's going to give way to some beautiful weather for the summer. And hopefully we're behind this COVID thing. Everybody starts to get out. I know that Texas is opened wide up, so hopefully your state is too. Just be safe out there, but enjoy all things the graciousness of God gives us. So again, appreciate you coming to the podcast today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about pull boxes and pull box calculations. And we're going to talk about the real world versus an exam world. Two different things. And I think a lot of times, sometimes educators get wrapped up in what they think an exam question should be versus what we really might see in the real world and how they have to mix them together. So this episode is going to kind of overlap the educational exam prep world versus the reality of the real world installation. And so you can kind of get the picture of both. Because on an exam, you don't know what they're going to throw at you. Okay? They could give you a pull box with the raceways coming into it, and they could show you the routing of the conductors and which raceways they go into. And some people think that they will always do that. I'm here to tell you they will not, because I've actually seen exam questions and helped write them that do not show any conductors in a pull box, just the raceways that come to a pull box. And you have to do a determination of what the worst case plausibility of how these conductors could route and size your box accordingly. But of course, there might be other exams that actually show you the routing of the conductors. And it is understandable that you would like to see the routing of the conductors because that can make a huge difference because we have dimensions. We have X dimensions, Y dimensions, Z dimensions. We'll talk about those today. But a lot of times you can't do something like a Z dimension, that is an angle between one raceway to another that share the same conductor. You can't really do that calculation unless you do know that those two raceways are sharing a mutual conductor. And so that's one of those things that it does help to actually have the conductors and show it. But I'm here to tell you that that is not always the case on an exam. It's not always that cut and dry. So I like to teach students to always look at it and come up with what the worst case scenario is for this box and then validate that by looking at the answers. Okay, that's key for me. So you have to be fluid enough to be able to do that. And so I like to teach people to do it without any conductors and to be able to do the calculation accordingly. And if all I'm asking you for is an X and a Y dimension, then I don't even think about the Z dimension because that's not what the question's asking me. That's how exams work. Now, in the real world, that's different. In the real world, we're going to size our pull boxes based on what our condition is, whether we're coming in from the left or from the right or from the top or from the bottom of the box. Heck, we even got to determine if we're coming in from the back of the box and have a removable cover on the front. All those things are real world situations that we know how we're going to make these boxes. We know where we're going to put these raceways. You just have to know the code rules that are associated with it. And anybody that tells you that you don't need to know code, they have no clue that they're actually installing and they're doing it in order to comply with code. So there's nothing worse than to put in a whole bunch of pull boxes and you're dealing with conductors 4 gauge and larger that are insulated and you didn't take all those, quote, code things into consideration and now you fail an inspection. But now you've got all these raceways run. It can be a nightmare. So whether you like it or not, you're dabbling in code all the time. So that's why I tell people, there's a hands-on element and then there's the mental part of it. And I believe we should always be in the mental part. Even if you're doing the hands-on day in and day out, you should take a certain amount of time in your week to spend an hour or really look at something in the code that pertains to your job. Maybe something comes up and you take time and grab your code book, blow off the dust, if you will, and then kind of look at the code a little bit. That might be all you need. And then there's other people that really have a passion for code. They know the hands-on part, but they start to really understand the nuances of the National Electrical Code and how important it is in your installation, how important it is in the growth of your career. Because we only get paid to do it once. We don't get paid to do it twice. Okay. If you pay somebody to do something twice, you're not going to be in business a long time. Okay. We know this. So when it comes to pull boxes, you either, on an exam, it either shows you a pull box with all of the Raceway entries, whether it's coming into the left, the right, the top, or the bottom of the box. And if they show you the routing of the conductors, then it's easy. If they don't show you the routing of the conductors, then you have to determine the worst possible scenario of which way these conductors could be routed, and you size your box accordingly. If they only ask you on an exam for an X and a Y dimension, that's left to right and top to bottom, they don't mention anything about angles or anything like that when it comes to, when I say angle, I mean where you have a Raceway that's coming in from the left and coming out of the bottom, and the same conductor that's coming in from the left turns and goes straight into the Raceway in the bottom. That means that conductor is sharing those mutual raceways, and then there has to be a certain distance, that's the Z dimension, between those two raceways. And we'll talk about that today, but these are all the things. So again, I have a lot of people out there who will say that they always have to show you the conductors and how they're routed in a box. That is not true. So in the real world, you know how you're going to route your conductors. If you don't have any straight pulls and you do everything with an angle pull because of the routing of your conductors, then so be it. But you have to think about these things. And so that's what I like to teach students, to think about it and realize that if you get stuck in a situation where they give you a box and they show raceways at that point, then, you know, one of the things you have to be able to do is determine what is the size of this box based on what information has been provided for me, that type of thing. So that's kind of what we're going to go through today, kind of giving you the, kind of the 50-cent tour of what today's episode's about. So we're going to talk about 314.28. This is pull and junction box and conduit body calculations. Now, first things first, we have to set the tone. This rule in 314.28 is dealing with insulated conductors 4 gauge and larger. And that doesn't matter whether they're in a Raceway or they're in a cable assembly. Okay. So insulated conductors 4 gauge and larger that are required to be insulated, and for cables containing conductors that are 4 AWG or larger. And of course, you could have an uninsulated inside of a cable assembly. MC, it's notorious for that. But it doesn't matter because here it's saying cables are included. As long as the contains conductors that are 4 gauge and larger, then you're going to follow these rules. All right. So first thing that we look at in here is it says, well, what are you going to use in order to do this calculation? Do you use inches? Do you use trade size? What do you do? Well, when it comes to raceways, the diameter of the Raceway, we're going to use what's called a metric designator. We're going to call trade size. And so this tells you that you're going to use, if it's a 4-inch Raceway, then it's a trade size 4. Then that's what you're going to use. You're going to use the 4. Now, here it's synonymous. If it's 4-inch, it's still trade size 4. No need to have any heartburn over it. But that's the value you're going to use. It also reminds you down at the very bottom of 314.28A2 that you're going to have to do what's called transposing cable sizes when you're doing these pull box calculations. Now, I'll go on and tell you what that is right now so that we can just kind of throw that off the table and you don't have to worry about it. If you see something that says transposing cable sizes, it's basically saying imagine an MC cable with 3-aught conductors in it, let's just say. You would need to determine what size actual Raceway that you're working with, whether it's rigid, intermediate, schedule AP, whatever you're working with. Then what you would do is you would take those conductors inside of it and pretend that the MC armor doesn't exist. So you're going to do a Raceway fill calculation as if you were putting these conductors that are inside of this MC in an actual Raceway. Just forget about the armor. Now, once you do a Raceway calculation and you determine what Raceway size you need, it's the minimum size Raceway. And obviously, in this case, you're not going to exceed the 40% Raceway fill requirement as if it was a Raceway when you had over 2 conductors in it. So once you do that, then you use this new value of the Raceway that you calculated out or you sized out for, and that's what you use in this calculation for your pull box. Okay, so that's called cable transposing. You just basically take the conductors inside of it and calculate what size raceway it would be if you were to take those conductors, pull them out of the MC, and then put them in the raceway. And then you use that raceway size to do all of your pull box sizing and all that type of stuff. Pretty simple stuff, right? So that's called transposing cables. It's basically forget that the cable armor exists and stick those conductors in a raceway, but you got to calculate what size raceway you would need. And once you do that, then you do it, okay? Also, people ask me, why am I redundant? I do it for a reason. I have teaching style that's redundant because I really want to hammer key topics home, and that's why I do it. If you don't like it, you have options. You don't have to listen to my podcast, and you certainly don't have to watch my videos. That's a choice that you get to make. All right. So at this point, let's go on and go down to 314.28A1. This is for straight pulls. Now, in straight pulls, the length of the box or conduit body shall not be less than 8 times the metric designator, that's the trade size, of the largest raceway. So let's just keep it simple. Let's say I have a pull box, and I've got on the left side, I've got coming in a trade size 3-inch rigid, let's say. And going out the right side, the opposite wall, I had the trade size 3 leaving. So that's a straight pull. It's coming straight into the box, going straight through and out the other side of the box. So my calculation, as it says in 314.28A1, is 8 times the largest raceway. So trade size 3 on the left is the same side as the trade size 3 on the right of the box. Then I only have to do one side because they're both the same size raceway. If one was larger than the other, then I would use whichever one was larger. And obviously it's going to be greater than the one that's on the opposite side. So in this case, trade size 3. So it would be 3 times 8 equals 24. So if it's a trade size 3 and it's a straight pull, think of straight is 8, same number of letters, it equals 8. Okay, rhymes with straight is 8. Okay, I guess that's obviously not the same number of letters, by the way. But just remember, straight is 8. I don't know why I said that. Anyway, so because it does make sense when I say angles, which is angles with an S is 6, so 6 times. So anyways, maybe that's why I said it. But anyway, think of straight is 8. So when you're going straight through, then you're going to take the largest raceway times 8, and that's the minimum dimension. And we refer to that dimension from left to right. At least I refer to that dimension as the X dimension. Okay. Other places might refer to it differently. That's how I refer to it. All right. So that's your straight pull. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's left to right or they come into the bottom and go out the top. That's a straight pull. Now, the one thing that people ask me all the time about these pulls is, okay, Paul, what's the depth of the box? And if it's a straight pull, what's the height of the box? What's the Y dimension since you have no Y dimension calculation? And what's the depth of the box? The reality is there is no rule on that. It has to be deep enough and wide enough in order to be able, or tall enough, I guess I should say, not wide enough. That's my X dimension. It should be tall enough and deep enough to accommodate the lock nuts, the bushings, and the raceway itself. And as long as it's able to accommodate that, then that's as deep as it needs to be, and that's as tall as it needs to be. And that's it. Don't overthink it. That's it. Basically, it's just like your raceway. It's just probably square. Not much difference. Okay. So that's your straight pull. Now, when it comes to, and I should say also, you notice that it said for conduit bodies, right? Same concept. So let's say I have like a type C conduit body. In that scenario, it's the same deal. I have a removable cover on those, but it's from the left side to the right. It's going to be the same thing. It's minimum size of a type C conduit body. It's going to be 8 times the diameter of the raceway that's supplying the conduit body. Okay. Pretty straightforward, I think. Most people would, have any confusion with that. All right. So, for example, if I had a raceway coming into a conduit body, like a type C conduit body, which is just coming in and out. It's not an LB, right angle, that type of thing. Then it would be if I had 4 THHNs in it and I was trade size 1 conduit coming in, then it's pretty simple, right? 8 times 1, it's 8. So that from the point of entry to the point of entry on the other side of the type C conduit body, it's got to be at least 18 inches to be the rule. Okay, so it's got to be at least 18 inches long. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Now LBs are a little different, LRs a little different, but you're using angle calculations. We'd be using the values for 314/28A2 for those. Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so we just kind of done everything that's associated with the straight pull. Now, the confusion will start now when it comes to angle pulls, U-pulls, or splices. So 314.28A2 is dealing with splices, and there's certain rules. Even when you're just doing splices in a box, you're still going to meet the 6 times rule that we're going to read here in a second, even though it's just splices. All right, so it says where splices or where angle or U-pulls are made, the distance between each raceway entry inside the box or conduit body and the opposite wall of the box or conduit body shall not be less than 6 times the metric designator, that's the trade size, of the largest raceway in a row. Okay, so I've got this box and I have a raceway coming in from the left side and I have a raceway going out the bottom. Okay, since I've got one coming into the left, but I don't have it going out the right, so obviously there's no straight pull involved because the only other raceway is in the bottom, and there's nothing on the opposite wall, which is the top of that raceway in that pull box. Then all I've got here is an angle pull. And guess what? I wouldn't need to show you the conductors in this box because there's only one plausible direction that these conductors could go. It's it. They could come in and go down. That's it. They can come up and go to the left. That's it. So I do hear a lot of people that say on exams that they always have to show you the route of the conductors. That is not true. Don't get complacent thinking that they're always going to show you the routing of the conductors. They are not. Some calculations in pull box doesn't necessarily need that application. Okay, so just kind of keep those little things in mind as we talk about the angle pulls. All right, so in our case, we have a box and I have a trade size 3 on the left and I have a trade size 3 coming out the bottom. So that's an angle pull. Obviously, it's going to come in and the conductors are going to go at an angle and go out another raceway. All right, so it says that we have to do 6 times. It's the metric 6 times the metric designator. So it's a trade size 3. So remember what it said? It says from the entry to the opposite wall. Forget about the other raceway right now. It's from the entry to the opposite wall. And we're going to work our way around the box, right? Start from the left side, then do the bottom, then do the right if there's a raceway on the right, and then do the top if there's a raceway on the top. In this case, it was only a raceway on the left and one coming out of the bottom of the box. Okay, not the back of the box, the bottom of the box. All right, so in this case, it's 6 times the largest raceway. In this case, it's a trade size 3 on the left. So 6 times 3 is 18. So that dimension from that entry on the left to its opposite wall, which I like to call the X dimension, is going to be at least 18 inches. There's no other raceways on that side. If there was another raceway on that side that's right next to that trade size 3, let's say a trade size 1, then what the rule says, and I'll continue on, it says the distance shall be increased for additional entries by the amount of the sum of the diameters of all other raceway entries in the same row on the same wall of the box. So what that means is if I have a trade size 3 on the left and I have another trade size 1 right next to it in the same row, then it says that I would do the 6 times the 3 plus I add the sum of the other raceways that are in the same row. So if there's a trade size 1 right beside that 3, then it would be 6 times 3, which is 18, plus 1, which is 19. So that X dimension from left to right, from the left entry to the opposite wall, would get increased to 19 inches. See how that works? And if you had another one right beside it, you would add that value to it as well. Okay, you just add the sum, but you have to do the base calculation first, and that is the largest raceway times 6, and then the sum of the other raceways that are in the same row. So the next question that people say, well, what about if I have multiple rows? That's a pretty deep box, right? It's deep enough to accommodate 2 rows of raceways coming in, let's say, from the left side. Okay, pretty simple stuff. You treat each row separate. Whichever one results in the largest dimension or the greatest X dimension, in this case, because we're going left to right, then that would be the dimension you use. So I don't have to add both rows together. I just look at which row would be the largest, and that is all I need. And that's the maximum size. Or excuse me, that's the minimum size that you would need. Okay, it could always be bigger, but that's the minimum size. So that's how you do each row. Now, once you finish that left side, you go to the bottom and repeat the process. Same process. And again, you're trying to determine the distance between the entries to the opposite wall. You're not theoretically worrying about any angles right now. You're actually measuring to the opposite wall. So that's how you're going to get your now from the bottom up. We're going to call that the Y dimension, right? So we had the X left to right, and we have the bottom to the top or top to the bottom, whatever. That'd be the Y dimension. Make sense? And you follow the same course of action. If it's multiple rows, you do each row separately, whichever results in the greatest dimension, then that's the dimension you use. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay, it's pretty simple stuff when you think about it. Now, that's not to mean that pull calculations can't get complicated, because they can get complicated. But if you break them down one side wall at a time, it gets easier. Trust me. Now, this is why I tell people all the time, I get people I wrote this article called The Stagnant Mind, and it has to do with the perception of some educators and some in the industry saying that on an exam, you will always have the routing of the conductors shown. And I emphatically disagree. I don't even know if that's a proper use of that word, but I'm just an electrician. But that is not true, because I have physically seen exams that do not show the conductor routing, and they're wanting you to determine the plausibility of the route to determine the size of the actual pull box. And that's what they're going for. And I know this to be true because I sat on a code development panels that did that. And you can say, well, Paul, that's stupid. Y'all should have never done that. Well, I don't care about your opinion. It just is what it is. You're going to run into them out there. And for my students, I want to make sure that they understand how to do what's called a plausible design. And that is what it could be if you're given a situation where they just show you the box and the raceways and you have to do the math. And that's what I want to show you how you would do that. And that's what I typically do. And you can check that article out by going over to my website. And I think it's under the blog posts, if you will, on that. Okay. Anyway, so that's what you would do for angles. Now, U-pulls, things like that. Oh, no, wait a minute. Before I get into that, let's go on and go into the exception. So now there's an exception. The exception understands that, typically the depth of the box, how deep a box is really only required to be as deep as it takes to accommodate the lock nuts and the bushings and the raceways and things like that. It's got to be deep enough for you to be able to cut those holes and be able to put them in. That's it. That's usually all that's necessary for the depth of a box. However, there are many occasions where a raceway or cable will actually come into the back of a box, and it'll be opposite a removable cover, right? So you've got the top, the bottom, the left, and the right of a box, but you also have the back. And on the front, you obviously have an access or removable cover to get inside the box. So there's an exception that says, look, you don't have to follow this 6 times and whatnot for the conductors that are coming into the back of the box. But I do need to set some parameters on the depth of this box. So here's what it says, exception. It says where a raceway or cable entry is in the wall of a box or conduit body opposite a removable cover, the distance from that wall to the cover shall be permitted to comply with the distance requirements for 1 wire per terminal in table 312.6a. So you go to table 312.6a, you go to the 1 terminal because it tells you to. And you go to the left and find the conductor size that you're dealing with. What's your largest conductor in the cable or raceway that's coming in the back of the box? Find that, go to the right, it'll give you a value, whether it's 6 inches, 4 inches, and that's the minimum depth. It cannot be less than that. Can it be greater than that? Absolutely, because it says this is the shall be permitted. Okay, so it's a permissive statement. So if you want it to be even deeper, that's fine, but it's got to be this value. So that's how you determine that. And you just use the 1 wire per terminal. You don't overthink it. You just follow what the code says. You go to that table, you find the size conductor, single conductor you're dealing with, go over and look under the 1 per terminal, And that's the size, and that's the minimum depth that you have if you've got a raceway or cable coming into the back opposite a removable cover. Okay, so that's how you use that, and that's also used for conduit body applications as well, which we'll talk about, maybe in a little bit later. That because people do ask that question too: how do we come up with the values for conduit bodies and things like that? All right, so that's what you do. That's the exception, and that whole exception is an exception to having to do the 6 times rule. Because it's just not plausible for a box that has an entry that's opposite a removable cover. It's just not. So that's why you have this exception. Now, if you want to make it 6 times, whatever, fine. But it's not something that you typically would do because of this exception. Now, let's talk about what happens when I have a box and let's say I had that box that I was talking about. And let's say I had trade size 3 coming in from the left and trade size 3 coming out the bottom. We already kind of did the math on this angle. 6 times 3 was 18, so it was an 18, and the bottom was 3. So the Y dimension from the bottom to the top was the same thing, 6 times 3. And the left to right, which is the X dimension, was the same thing, 6 times 3. Now, obviously, there's only 2 raceways here. So we know that the conductors that are going to be coming in from the left are going to turn and go down the raceway to the right. To the bottom, right? So that means that we have 2 raceways that are sharing a conductor. The same conductor is utilized in both these raceways. So now we have a rule that says, and I'm going to read it to you, it's 314.28a2, and it's under the exception. It says, the distance between raceway entries enclosing the same conductor shall not be less than 6 times the metric designator, trade size, of the largest raceway. So in this case here, if I've got a trade size 3 coming in and I got a trade size 3 going down, and the same conductor is coming in and turning and going down, then I have to do what? I have to make sure the distance between the raceways are at least 6 times the largest raceway. Of course, this is trade size 3, so it'd be 6 times 3. So that means there has to be 18 inches separation between these raceways. Well, if the box was only 18 by 18 to begin with, this is important because in the real world, in the real world, not on an exam where I didn't ask you for that dimension, I only asked you for the X and the Y, but in the real world, where you locate that raceway on the bottom is going to be huge because you have to move it. If we got it coming into the left and going out the bottom, obviously I got to move it to the right as far as I can in order to try to gain that separation of 18 inches between raceways. And you might not be able to do that with an 18 by 18. So it might mean that you have to go to an 18 by 19 if it's available, or 18 by 20 in order to accommodate the Z dimension. So important. Now on an exam, if they show you the conductors and the routing, then this is a pretty easy step. Okay, you can look and see which raceways these conductors come down. Not a problem. If you're not given any wires, you're just shown a box with raceways on it, then it's infinitely harder. This is why you have to look at the question and see what they're asking and look at the answers. So do your answers based on the plausible condition of the X and the Y, and then do a quick calculation and see that if this box would be able to accommodate the ability for you to have that Z dimension. And then look at the answers and see if there's other choices. Like it might say 18 by 18, but then the next answer might be an 18 by 19 box. And you're thinking, well, is that what they're shooting for? Okay. In the real world, you need to know these things. And I'm not telling you what you're going to get and what you're not going to get on an exam, but these are all rules that you have to think about. I have no idea what's ultimately going to be on your exam. But I'm telling you, if you get questions for sizing a pull box and they don't give you a diagram, they just tell you that you have a raceway coming in the left and a raceway coming into the right, and they want to know what the X and the Y dimension is, then you just solve for X and Y dimensions. You don't solve for Z. Okay? But look at your answers and see. Okay? So in the real world, I would tell you, in reality, you're sizing your boxes. You're going to know whether or not you're coming into the left and going through the bottom, or coming into the left and going out the right, or maybe you're doing larger conductors and you've got raceways in the top, the left, the bottom, and the right, and you've got a big raceway coming into the left and all these other raceways going out. You know which way you're going to route your conductors. You should know this. So you can size your box in the real world based on that. All I'm saying is if you get an exam, then it's on an exam that shows you the routing of the conductors, then it's easy. It's simple. If you see no straight pulls and everything is angles because they don't show any routing of a straight pull, then you don't use the straight pull value. You don't use the 8 times. You use everything 6 times, right? But in the absence of that, I want you to be able to solve something for the worst case scenario based on them giving you maybe a box with raceways coming into it, and that's all they gave you, right? That's it. So I just want you to be prepared. That's all for that. Okay. So and some people will criticize me and say that they will always show the wires. I disagree. I can tell you right now, I know of at least 3 exams that do not have conductors routed through their pull box calculation. Okay. So at any rate, just be prepared. If they show you the routing, then it's easy. It's either a straight pull or it's not. It's either angle pull or it's not. All right. And if it's a raceways that share a conductor, then there's a Z value in it that is going to play a factor, because I'm going to have to move that raceway as far as I can to the right in order to accommodate the distance between the raceways, if that's the case. Now, let me give you some advice here. If you were to take a splice and do a splice in that box, then this rule wouldn't come into play. So this is how I tell people, this rule wouldn't come into play. So this is what I tell people. If you have somebody that comes in and you can't get that distance separation and the box is already in play, then my advice is to break that conductor, cut it, and now you've got 2 separate conductors coming in. This rule wouldn't apply, and you don't have to maintain the spacing between the raceways. Okay, so just make a splice in there. Because the splicing rule, you still have to use the 6 times the opposite wall rule 6 times even for cables, but that does not come into play when you're doing splicing. When it comes to this rule, the separation, because that wouldn't be the same conductor coming in and going out. It's 2 separate conductors coming in that are getting spliced inside the junction box. That is different. So that might save your butt if you have a box and ultimately somebody says, oh, you got the 18 by 18 right, but you don't have that raceway 18 inches from the other raceway because the same conductor comes in one and then goes into the second. So it's one conductor sharing 2 raceways. You have to maintain that distance. You can look at them and go, okay, so you cut it, you put a Polaris splice in there, and then all of a sudden you get out of that, right? So just things to think about. Same thing that would happen for MC cable. So let's say I have a pull box and I come into the left side with MC cable. All right, we're going to talk about U-pulls here in a second, but I'm going to set the tone here. If I come in with MC cable and I have 2 MC cables, I don't have to meet the separation between the different cables. I still have to have the 6 times to the opposite wall, and I have to do what's called the transposing of cable sizes, as we talked about in the beginning, but I don't have to have the separation. Why? Because that's not the same conductor. It's spliced. It's 2 separate conductors coming in. Whereas in a raceway, like a U-pull, for example, it's the same scenario I has on the left side. I have 2 raceways coming in and the conductors come in and then take a U-turn and go straight back out. That is different because that conductor shares both of those raceways. I have to meet the rule of the separation between those raceways and be 6 times the largest raceway, which can dictate the size of your box, right? So since I'm coming in the left side, it's easy for me to take that. Let's say I calculated that MC cable, I transposed it, it ends up being trade size 2. Well, I can easily do 6 times 2, and I've got my dimension for the X, that's the left to right. But how do I calculate the dimension for the Y, top to bottom? Well, typically, straight pulls, you wouldn't do that. But since this is coming in from the left side, both of the MCs, then what I'm going to do is I don't worry about the distance between them because it's not the same conductor. They're being spliced in there. It's 2 separate MC cables coming to the box. But I still going to calculate from the left side to the right side. So your question to me is, well, how do I know how deep the box needs to be? How tall the box needs to be? Well, that's simple. It needs to be tall enough to accommodate the 2 cable assemblies and their lock nuts and their bushings and things like that. Okay, so there is requirements that you would have to do. And so that's how you would do it. Okay. And that would be ultimately, people would ask me, well, what's the minimum size dimension then for a Y if that was the case? then I usually will tell them, well, in that scenario, the dimension, it's pretty simple. You're going to have at least the rating or the transposed rating of the actual cables that are now being treated as raceways, because you have to transpose it. And I'm going to have at least the size of those. Plus, I have to accommodate the sidewall in order to be able to make the connection to the box. And that's the minimum dimension that I would need from top to bottom. But the left or right, even though it's a cable, it's still going to be 6 times, okay, the largest cable that's being transposed into a raceway. I hope that's not confusing. If it is, you came in late and you didn't listen to what I said about how to take an MC and take the conductors out of it and then do a calculation for raceway fill and determine what size raceway would I need to hold these conductors at a minimum. And then that's the value in trade size that you use for your calculation. Okay, hopefully you got all that back at the very beginning when I did that. All right, so that's what we're talking about with that. So that's what you would do if you had the U-pull. Again, it's very much you have to do the calculation to the opposite wall as you would normal for an angle, but then you have to do the separation between raceways, that type of thing. Unless, of course, you splice them. Now, when it comes to MC cable, you're obviously going to splice them, so there is no distance required between those raceways because, first of all, they're not raceways, they're cables, plus they're spliced so that it's 2 separate conductors connected together, not one single conductor that is sharing a cable. That's going to be impossible to do that with cable. All right, so at the end of the day, all right, that's how you would do it when you're doing the U-pull. So it's pretty straightforward. Now, again, just as a recap for when it comes to transposing cables, basically if I've got a MC cable, a feeder, and I need to do a pull box calculation, angle, I need to do a straight, then what I would do is act like I rip those conductors outside of the MC, use the same method I would for raceway fill calculation, Chapter 9, Table 4, Table 5 type of scenarios, do the same way and select the size raceway that I would need to hold the conductors that are in the MC, but as if I was putting them into a raceway. And then you come up with that size. Let's say it ends up being a trade size 2. Then that's what you would use in your calculation here at 314.28a. Okay, that's how you would do it. All right, now when it comes to LBs, I usually tell people an LB is basically doing it the same way that you would with an angle pull. So think of an LB and lay it on its side. So it goes straight up and then the LB portion goes to the left and the removable cover is on the right. So you're laying it on a side. And so you have a bunch of different dimensions. So since this is an angle, you start from the entry of the raceway that comes into the LB, the furthermost entry, and you measure to the opposite wall. And then that's the one dimension, and that is 6 times the raceway's value, okay? 6 times the diameter of the raceway, okay? And the next thing you're going to do is the portion from the removable cover to the entry of the other end of the raceway that's coming in, the shorter portion, the backside that's opposite the removable cover. So that way, it says at least needs to be equal to at least the distance that it's given in Table 312.6a for the given size of conductor as shown in the column, and you're using the 1 wire per terminal value. Same concept. Now, because this is a raceway, it's going to, obviously it's an LB or an LR or whatever. It's going to be carrying the same conductor is mutual in each raceway. I mean, that's obviously a given. So that means you're going to have that Z dimension or that third value. And you're going to be measuring that from the raceway entry in the LB at one end diagonally to the raceway entry of the raceway at the other end of the LB. Now, good news is if you buy the LB and it's designed to fit a certain trade size, then this is already going to be taken care of for you. There's nobody out there making rogue LBs, but a lot of times people want to know how do I calculate the dimensions of this? So pretty straightforward. So if I've got an LB, and let's say this LB is containing 4 THW conductors, and the raceways that are coming into it is 1 1/4 inches. All right, so we're saying it's an 1 1/4 inches that's coming in. Then the first dimension would be from the first entry, the longest side, to the opposite edge would be 6 times 1 1/4, 7.5. So it has to be 7.5 from the point of the raceway in the LB to the opposite wall. Okay, and that's that dimension. Now, from the other raceway entry to the removable cover, that one is going to be based on table 312.6a. And since it's containing 4-gauge conductors, once I get to table 312.6a, I just take one of them and I find the 4-gauge, and that says that it's required to be 2 inches. So from the point of entry to the short side of the LB to the opposite removable cover, that has to be at least 2 inches. And of course, then there's that Z dimension that I say from the raceway at the short dimension of the LB to the raceway that comes in the long dimension of the LB. The distance between those would be 6 times 1 1/4, and that is 7.5. So that dimension as well needs to be 7.5. Again, the manufacturers take care of this, so you don't typically have to worry about it. But I just felt like it's good that you understand that even when you're coming into an LB, there's still some things that are coming into play. There's still some things that are thought about when the manufacturers are doing these pull boxes and these LBs and things like that. Okay. Now, granted, for a pull box, you can order them in a variety of different sizes. Same with LB, but it tends to be very dependent on the size of the raceway that's coming in. Those type of things. All right, so that's pretty much it when it comes to the pull boxes. Again, some of the little tricks and tips that I tell people. Again, if I'm coming in with 2 raceways and the box was already sized and it contains the same conductors coming in and going out, I would, and I can't maintain the distance between the raceways because it's like a U-pull or something, then you could splice that conductor instead, put a Polaris splice or put some other splicing device in there. And at that point, you don't have to have the separation requirement between raceways because it's a splice. But if it comes in and it's the same conductor coming in one raceway and it's leaving in another raceway, then there has to be a separation between those raceways. Okay, so that's an unbroken, let's say, conductor. So that's just other things to think about when it comes to it. I guess my last tip for everybody before we close out on this is don't overthink it. But there is a significant difference between the real world and an exam world. In exam world, if they show you all the routing conductors in a box and all the raceways that enter, then only calculate out what they show you. Okay, if there ends up being everything is an angle and there's no plausible straight pull because they show you the routing, then don't do a straight pull calculation. Size everything for angles and work one wall at a time. Okay. If they give you a calculation that shows you a box with no conductor routing, then my advice is to work all plausible answers. Could some of the conductors go straight? Yes. Could some of them go to the left? Yes. So always work the greatest plausible answer. And that might mean you do a straight as 8. And then you might also have to do those same dimensions as an angle and see which one of them results in the bigger box. And always check your questions on an exam to see if the answers are in tune with your calcs. Because obviously you got to pick one, and there's going to be one right answer. Okay, so remember that. In the real world, be very conscious of the fact that when you put your pull boxes in and you're routing your raceways, that you cut your holes into your boxes with the understanding there is a X dimension, there is a Y dimension, but there is going to be a Z dimension. If you have conductors coming in on one side and going out the other side or going out the bottom, and those raceways will share a conductor, then you have to make sure that there's a distance separation between those raceways. Not that big a deal, obviously, for a straight pull because you're already going to have straight as 8, but in an angle pull can become a very big deal. And you just have to be careful where you put them. Remember, if you always get into a bind, then one of the things that you have to remember that even if you splice it, you still got the 6 times the opposite wall requirement. That's not changing. But splicing might help you if you can't keep the distance between raceways that enclose the same conductor. So if you cut it and you splice it, it's no longer the same conductor. It's two different conductors and you're splicing in a box. And that might help you when it comes to having to maintain the distance between raceways that enclose the same conductor, because then it no longer would enclose the same conductor. Okay. If that confuses you, just go look at 314.28A2. Listen to this podcast again and look at each little piece and it'll all start to make sense. Okay. Anyway, that's all I've got for today's podcast. Hopefully you got something out of it. Gave you a little bit of insight into pull box calculation. If I confused you, apologize. Did the best I could to paint you a mental picture. Check us out over on our website, masterthenec.com. We have a lot of blogs, things like that you can check out. Also, go to thesparkyhub.com. Join the forum, post your questions, post your pictures of your installations. It's a safe way to get away from the Facebooks and all the prying eyes of all that crap. It's an opportunity for electricians to share and chime in, but it's a no-hate zone. Everybody there is there to help. So check it out. Go to www.thesparkyhub.com. If you want any of our merchandise, shirts, we've got so many designs, so many shirts, polo shirts, jackets with master electricians, so many neat things. I don't do the funky, nasty logos things. I do the professional stuff that you'd be proud to wear on your uniform for your customers and things like that. That's what I do. So check that out over at Electrician Pride. That's electricianpride.com, or you can just go to our website, masterthenec.com, and click the merchant button up at the top. You highlight over it, you'll see all the neat stuff that we offer on our website now. So until next time, folks, stay safe. God bless, and hope you got something out of today's episode.
Shut up and sit down.